Next up is David Caballero, who is going to be identifying defensible spaces at the micro and meso scales, and he'll have some examples in the wildland-urban interface and the Mediterranean for us. David, when you're ready, we'll let you take it off.
Thank you, Chairman. Buona tarda a tothom. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm here. Thank you very much for the opportunity to bring to you some of the results of the WeWatch project. WeWatch project is a common effort of a team of entities across Europe. Try to keep an eye on the wildland user interface and the forest fire risk in Europe. This is the consortium of WeWatch. It's people from Spain, from Portugal, Italy, France. We embrace the whole forest fire community. And we have held 4 workshops that we've been dealing with a number of subjects on the wildland user interface and fires, particularly prevention, vulnerability, human factor, and lately the one we had in Valencia some weeks ago on operations and safety, the wildland user interface. We've produced some experiments, some very nice data about some of the aspects about vulnerability and houses protection in real experimental fires that we did in Portugal with help of our colleagues from Siren and Adai, Portugal. My presentation will try to bring here some of the lessons learned, what that means in terms of safety and protection strategies for the future for our communities in Europe, particularly what has to do with the Mediterranean countries. We have been suffering some fires this campaign. To provide a rational approach to the problem, we are looking at 3 different scales, broadly understood as scales. First one is macro scale. Our colleagues were talking about is at landscape level. Second one is what we call the meso scale. Actually, is the tissue of the settlements of the communities that we have here. And finally, is what has to do with the surroundings of the house, what we call the micro scales. You have to understand that each of the scales requires a different data granularity because the fire has a different reading space. So we are trying to be rational in our approach. What we have learned in the last fires that we have in Portugal, France, Spain, and so. That if we look in the second scale, I will concentrate on what has to do with the settlement scale. We have identified 3 types of tissues which are relevant for the fire protections. The first one has to do with the internal mesoscale, the internal tissue of vegetation on non-burnable parts, and particularly pointing out what the importance of undeveloped lots on the edges. Second is the perimeter of the mesoscale, and what has to do with the perimeter fire break on the perimeter logs. And finally, what we call the extension of the concept of this defensible area or extended mesoscale. Let's have a look on that more closely. First, we look into the settlement. We can see a pattern of burnable and unburnable materials. Particularly important are the undeveloped lots. As we have here, this is an undeveloped lot, which is creating a friction inside the settlement. It's not real friction from the fire from heating the settlement, but it's inside the settlement. That means that something has to ignite this. Normally, it's the firebrand fall there. So it is connecting the fire somewhere else to this local fire, affecting the houses locally, creating a local friction due to the effect of the fire brands. So we have here a combination, accumulation of different types of materials. The forest, fuel, plus the vegetal remainings of people threw in there, and other type of materials, which are all together providing a huge fire load. And this is the result that we have seen. This is flat, just the wind blowing, but we have a huge amount of burnable material which is there to burn near the house, and catching the surrounding vegetation, more particularly the hedges. And here we have the pattern of fire spread in our settlements. These fire brands with undeveloped lots and edges, that's creating locally high-intensity fires, which is affecting a huge number of houses at the same time. And this points out particularly what happens with the perimeter fire breaks. Are they useful? Well, they are useful, but they are not stopping the fire. So we are looking into the edges, and this is the patterns of vegetation that we have inside, and the importance in terms of the fire spread inside the settlements. As you can see, all these type of hedges and undeveloped lots. So trying to find these defensible spaces does point to the amount of available fuel to burn and the total fire load that we have behind or near the houses. And that's point out that how do we manage with all these materials? Sometimes it is not just vegetations, other fields as well. What happens in other countries, in other fires, like this one in Rognac, near Marseille in France, that by law they are forced, they have to clean 50 meters around the houses. If of the houses is cleaning of these large plots, all the material, they are in the understored. They are not cutting the trees. They are actually putting away most of the understored fuel. What that happens that is all these donuts create a tissue, all of them together, which creates a very nice mesoscale. What happens when the fire comes here, it comes in very low intensity, medium intensity, something that we can fight too. So we have reduce the fire load, so we can have some opportunities to firefight more safely. And the second interesting point is when this low intensity fire that comes from the surface is hitting one of the lots which has a good irrigation pattern, the fire does not affect very much to the internal garden. So we see reducing the fire load, increasing the moisture of the living plants. Wow, yeah, it's very nice to think about that. And these are our safe places. That's what we are pointing out. Reducing our fuel load, increasing the living plants' moisture content. Why? Because we cannot ask the people to remove all the plants, just to adapt the plants to this fire situation, to this fire spread. We have several of these elements. So that points us towards if we want to find these safety zones, following our colleagues Brett Butler and Jack Cohen works, we have to reduce the fuel load and at the same time create the spaces which can be used by the people. Why? We are creating these dialogue spaces to be used by the people because they have to be maintained. And that's another idea that we got from these fires. If you do not maintain the fuel breaks, they will not adapt to the growth of the surrounding vegetation. And this also applies to the perimeter fibers, as we will say later. But given some use of those fibers like this corridor and path, that keeps a dialogue between the people and the forest, but at the same time, it's much easier to keep that clean under control. Second thing has to do with the perimeter lots. They are different, they are important in our case. This is the first barrier. But when we talk about perimeter, in our case, it's not that easy, because sometimes we have these, let's say, patterns of fuel inside the settlement, so we are creating friction or this perimeter, the impact area in every point. What happens is that exactly in those places is when we put most of the fuel there, all the remains, and leave all the vegetation, grow freely. So we are creating phylos exactly whatever we don't want to have. Besides, we have all the gardens, the edges, unmaintained on some emancipating plants, and so creating a huge fuel load exactly in the point we don't want that. So we need the collaboration of the owners. Everything is pointing toward the owners first. Point towards the transformation of the gardens first, and then jump to the other thing, which is the perimeter fabric. At least in our case, that's important. We made a huge effort to create an 80-meter perimeter fabric, while we have a huge fire load here because of the gardens. So we have very little chance. The same for the lots which are in the perimeter with these separations due to terrace, pools, and other constructions. It has shown several fires like this in Valencia. They are very valuable structures to separate the radiation, among other things, from the destruction of the house. We have many cases acting like that, so like a, let's say, separation, which is very interesting for the house's protection. Besides, we have these perimeter fabrics. As I say, they do not grow as the vegetation is growing. What we suggest is to create, again, different, let's say, vegetation structure which are evolving together with the fabric. I mean, if we maintain all this vegetation, the fabric should be at the same time widen accordingly. To finalize, the importance of the accessibility to the perimeter and the perimeter lot. If we put some of the houses behind the perimeter road, we are offering this new friction towards the wildland. Our suggestions, if we want to create defensible spaces, is to embrace all the houses with a perimeter road. Finally, to talk a little bit about the stern mesoscale. Normally, what we have in our countries is a lack of management and accumulation of fuel. Normally, that entails locally a fire intensity increase towards the settlements. So again, what we suggest, dimension new vegetation structures according to what you normally had historically there as this type of this or this type of low fuel structures, and maintain that not only with the criteria of lowering the intensity, but to keep the fire in an intensity we can fight. That's the idea that has been drawn by other speakers before. So what we did, following our colleagues from Brett Butler and Jack Cohen ideas of the defensible space, is to create an indicator of the intensity of the treatments to be done in the vegetation to create defensible space. What that means is that if I have to reduce the amount of fuel of the red part and a little less in the yellow part, just to understand that. That points again to the same principle. I need to treat more frequently, and with first priority, the internal vegetation, particularly what I have in the gardens, then developed lots and the surrounding houses first, and then work on the perimeter. That's interesting. If I want to work behind near the houses, I need to be protected with not so much fuel load. And the same applies, you see, for the roads. If I have all this fuel load, I can't safely work in the roads. So I apply the same principle to the roads, which is the amount of treatment, the intensity of the treatments on the vegetation to keep the roads operation on the roads safe. So mixing, this is another example here near Barcelona. This is called Cerola. This is a treatment extension of vegetation if I want to work near to the houses, and the same for the roads. Coupling both of them, I have this mesoscale, more or less treatment. You see, it is much more than the perimeter strap. On this point, again, first you have to concentrate when you have surrounded your houses, which is the message given by our colleagues in the United States before. To finalize, I have 3 or 4 minutes to finalize this point always to the microscale. The owner the houses, the garden edges, that's very relevant first, and particularly the edges. The edges accumulate an enormous amount of fuel, fine fuel load because of the treatment. So I want to reduce the fine fuel load of the fuel, that fuel. I need to select, first of all, the type of plant and select the treatments. Otherwise, this is what happens, burn like hell all around the house. We have hundreds of examples of the importance and the intensity of the fire affecting and surrounding the house and creating structural destruction as we have here. We have several species that we have seen, this is in Funchal in Portugal, that burn not so aggressively, so we have a chance to use some of these edges as well without creating this problem. So we control first the amount of fine fuel load, and second, the amount of water in the living plants. And this example, again, in Funchal. It was a prepare lot with less fuel and enough amount of water. And in the opposite, this is in France, and in Rognac, you have nothing but this edge of trees, one of it slightly touching the roof of the house, and that was enough to destroy the house. So be careful with the surrounding field that you had in your house. Normally it is vegetation, but it cannot vegetation, all type of field which is providing a phenomenal amount of fire load. And that's the most important. This is a lesson learned from our colleagues from the United States. They were warning us. Be aware of that, and that's absolutely true. Here you have very, very dramatic example of the destruction of a house that should not be destructed at all, because the fire load was not so big in the forest, but it was enormous due to the signals that we have in the facade, due to the amount of objects and other materials burning, touching the house and entailing the total destruction. See, it's what we saw in Funchal. This is the fire approaching from the eucalyptus fire, and this is what we found in our visit there, an incredible amount of different types of objects. Look there, that a small separation of this little orchard prevented from affecting the neighborhood house. In the end, what we're suggesting to do, together with creating these defensible spaces, is in the opposite, to identify which of the houses are defensible and which are not. And that should be done by assessment from the firefighters. So in advance, they say to the owners, look, here, I can do very little to save your house. Well, in this, we can do something. Do that in advance. It's what we do normally in my firm. This in Corserola, it's in the head of a box canyon surrounded by fields, very poor construction. This is what we have inside. This is a loser in case of a fire. So here's what we have I take care of my time, Chairman, no problem. This is what we provide, a triage according to the exposure to the nearby fire, the close fire, the fired fire. The fired fire normally is the firebrand, and we provide that in our. And some remarks about safety. Look, this is more or less urban zone. It is not actually a friction with. This is in Funchal. But look at this corridor. If you have a fire here, you have to escape from those houses you are entrapped. It's what happened, more or less is what happened. You have a small corridor, fire coming here. All this fire, due to the surrounding materials, there's not vegetation materials, you create a potential entrapment and the death of people. So extend the concept of entrapment to the urban area as well, affected by forest fires, or the domino effect affecting, in these cases, some LPG tanks. And LPG tanks for us is another matter of concern, affected by forest fires. In Europe, we have very poor regulation. That in Spain, there's no regulation at all. We did a research on that. We have no regulation at all. At this moment, nothing happened. They are very well built. But owners around all these LPG tanks, by small, let's say, edges, In terms of total fire load, it's very, very small, but they are so close, they have flame contact. So what we expect is this tank is exposed to direct flame contact for a small time. So in my view, something will happen when these safety valves fail. You can have a bleve because of this. It's a very small one, vaporization is very quick. You can have this problem. With all these final remarks, more or less on time, control of data and fine fuel load structures around the houses, ornamental vegetation, edges, accumulation of vegetal remains. Together with that, we had the opportunity to create a different fuel moisture by irrigation patterns and design specific gardening. We see that we need a crew training and equipment to operate in those environments. We propose a triage and identify defensible houses. Of course, we need owner education and awareness of what's going on. Otherwise, they are telling, my house burned because of the firefighters didn't do the work well. No, dear lady, no. You were surrounded by field. Some brands come there and destroy your house. That's a reality. You have to understand that much of the fault was yours. Prioritization of field treatment. Dimension of mesoscales told you, starting from the inside, going to the outside. And finally, thank you very much for your attention, more or less on time.
Thank you, David. Questions for David? Back.
In Spanish, Hola, David.
Hola.
Quería preguntar si en este pretriaje de viviendas, en los tratamientos de vegetación, has tenido en cuenta o se tiene en cuenta si el incendio es conducido por viento o es un incendio topográfico para adaptar las anchuras de los tratamientos al fuego, a la carrera de fuego que le llegará.
Bueno, I will answer in English, okay? We can apply exactly that to the different fire situations we expect. The first thing we do the analysis for the prevention, so it's the type of fires we expect, if they are hitting from the head, from the flank, of the rear. Absolutely yes. But this is statistical. If you are in the box canyon, you have the house there, for sure, the worst case of scenario would come from the box canyon hitting from the head. So you have to adapt all this. At this moment, the only information that we have is the fuel load. So we expect the maximum flame length for all the points. That means if we think about the worst case scenario from all the possible directions, even if they are statistically not possible, we create this structure. It's much easier to implement in the real world. It's much easier. If you are trying to adapt many things difficultly, it's much better to create a structure for the worst case scenario. So technically the answer is yes. Practically the answer is, well, we do it much easier considering the worst case scenario in all directions. That's more or less the idea.
We have time for one more question, and then we'll move to our last speaker. Do I see a hand? All right, let's move to our, thank you again. That was a great presentation.
Thank you very much.